Yay! A death gets off!
A farmhand pressed a fistful of coarse salt into the open flesh at the back of the man's thigh and pushed his chin down with the heel of his hand. "Look at it," the farmhand said. "Let the animals finish what you started." The chronicler watched the salt bite and winced once, then arranged his ledger on his knee and wrote the time. Suspicion tightened his jaw as he counted the initials on the sheet. He had felt suspicion before, at rumors, at returned prisoners whose stories did not match the orders, but this was a method recorded with signatures and dates. That suspicion pushed him forward. It would drive him to catalogue details others hoped to bury. He moved along the damp corridor with the gait of a man who had served 3 decades in the scriptorium. He was 50, too lean and slightly stooped, robes patched at the elbows, spectacles cold brass on his nose. He carried a leather-bound ledger and a bone-handled quill. The smell of cold parchment and candle smoke clung to his sleeves. He had kept records of plague counts and land tithe changes, of who petitioned and who was denied, and the fortress allowed him access because the ledger made cruelty legible. He walked because the ledger made orders into paper, and paper could be shown to others. The prisoner writhed against tethered ropes as animals circled, nostrils flaring. One goat edged forward and licked a wound. Its rough tongue peeled a thin layer of skin. The farmhand laughed and spat. "You begged for mercy when they took your fields, did you not?" The prisoner said nothing. The chronicler recorded the sequence. Salt applied, animals encouraged, restricted water. He wrote the bootprints on the earthen floor, the smear of salt on a wooden post, the darkened hem of the farmhand's sleeve. The immediate problem was clear and precise. The fortress used salt with animals to prolong pain until the victim could no longer resist. It was punishment sold as discipline. A guard stepped forward and tapped the ledger with a knotty finger. "Name." The guard said to the chronicler, "Write it quick." "We have orders." The chronicler looked up, eyes cold gray in the candle glow. "This ledger names the sender, not the victim," he said. "I record what I see." He spoke 3 words measured enough to be heard, then returned to the page. His voice held no outrage, his gestures tightened. His hands moved like mechanical instruments. The first emotion, suspicion, had shifted into active scrutiny. He inspected wounds, compared months, counted signatures. That shift would later change again, when a name on the margin matched the lord he had believed concerned only with rents. The corridor smelled of damp straw and old blood. A second prisoner lunged from a dark cell and grabbed the tethered man's wrists. Guards barked orders, "Let go, Harrow." A guard shouted, "If you move, we cut you down." The other prisoner, Harrow, had a scar across his knuckle. He lunged anyway, fingers scrabbling at knots. The chronicler raised his hand in a small, neutral gesture, as if to mark an important line in the ledger. His motion was precise and small, but it carried intent. He wrote the time of the scuffle and the guard names. Brand Kale, Warden Rise. The scuffle failed. Guards hauled Harrow back, struck him, and tightened a rope. A guard shoved the animal handler to the side and whispered, "More salt. Make them scream longer tonight." The lord left his mark. The chronicler's pen paused. His suspicion hardened into the next shift. From scrutiny to a cold, contained horror expressed through recording every signature and every stain. They took the prisoner to the low room where the chronicler could examine injuries by candlelight. He unfastened the leather strap across his ledger and used the bone-handled quill to prod at the margins of entries he had made earlier. Warden Rice signed it himself. He said without raising his voice, "Page 32. Seal 3, the warden's face tightened. "You write what you are told to write, chronicler. Record the outcome and move on." He leaned in, voice flat. "Do not tie us up with your scrawl." The chronicler tapped the quill on the page and said, "The ledger is for truth." I record procedure, not rumor. His phrasing stayed factual, but his fingers had begun to tremble as he described puncture angles and the grain size of salt. His reactions were small, visible motions, an emotion expressed through body, not speech. He inspected the wounds closely. Jagged abrasions along the thigh, raw flesh glistening with salt crystals, a crust staining the rope. He lifted the victim's eyelid to watch for fever, tested pulse with 2 fingers, and marked the readings. The chronicler's method was to measure what could be measured. Degrees of temperature, the depth of lacerations in units he used for tax rolls. He terse questions of the guard. When did you apply salt? How long between dressings? Who ordered no water? The guard answered in clipped lines. At dusk. 2 hours. Lord Mayor on the ledger. Then the chronicler made a small but decisive move. He asked for the order's ledger. The farmhand swore and slapped a dirty page on the table. The paper had a spatter of salt that had dissolved into fibers. Signatures spread across the margin like an official stain. The chronicler fanned the leaves and read names aloud while another guard sniffed and shifted his weight. Mayor Tolan, Scribe Dovat, the chronicler. Each name changed the scene's arithmetic. This was not isolated cruelty, but a chain stretching across offices and farms. The chronicler's suspicion turned into a decisive action. He made an exact transcription by hand, copying ink thickness, seals, and fold marks. He pressed his thumb to a page where a wax seal was broken and left a faint smudge of candle wax as evidence. A prisoner in the next stall began to sing low, a broken rhythm used to steady hands before a blow. Harrow hissed, "You write that down, chronicler, and you make us feathers for the Lord's hat." The chronicler paused, then said, "Harrow, I write what I see, not what I wish." The 2 men exchanged 5 short lines, Harrow cursing, the warden issuing threats, the farmhand blaming theft. The dialogue kept tempo, fast, compact, revealing motive and pressure. The warden, "If you lift this ledger beyond the gate, we hang you for stirring trouble." The chronicler put the ledger under his arm and walked out. He did not run. He walked with an even pace, because he wanted witnesses to notice his ledger as he moved. At midnight the prisoner rescue attempt occurred. Harrow had finished biding time and twisted free enough to reach the knot. He lunged at the rope. The guards reacted in 3 sharp movements. A club swing, a boot to the ribs. "A man seizing Harrow's collar, Harrow!" The prisoner who had been licked screamed, voice raw. A guard slammed the prisoner's head into the post. The animals were urged nearer. The chronicler wrote down each strike and every order that followed. He also recorded the sudden escalation. The warden's voice moving from instruction to an order that sounded like permission to kill. "Make it last until dawn. Warden, rise." We show them the ledger and the Lord's will. The attempted rescue failed. The consequence was immediate and brutal. The chronicler's reaction shifted again, this time toward a quiet, purposeful resolve expressed in choice. He would keep a copy and hide it in the scriptorium. Back in the corridor, the chronicler found a salt-stained order partially forgotten in straw. He picked it up with steady fingers and read the marginal note. For repeat theft, salt and livestock. Signed Mayor. He compared the handwriting to earlier pages and confirmed a match. He folded the scrap and hid it in the inner cover of his ledger. The farmhand caught the motion and jabbed a finger at him. "What are you hiding, scribe?" The farmhand demanded. "Nothing that concerns you." The chronicler. He spoke slowly so guards and farmhands could hear. His words were chosen to avoid giving them a legal hook while still signaling intent to any literate watchers who might read his face. This was a small tactic. Conceal evidence in plain sight and test which men noticed. Before dawn, the chronicler returned to the scriptorium with a satchel and the ledger tucked beneath a folded robe. He unlatched a wooden chest and set the ledger inside, then ran his thumb along the spine as though blessing a relic. He copied selected lines onto separate folios. Names, seals, dates, the phrase salt and livestock. He numbered the folios, bound them with twine, and left them in a narrow slot used for complaint petitions. He did this because the ledger, once copied and distributed to certain Abbey contacts, would not vanish even if a page was burned. His actions were the outward expression of a final emotional shift, suspicion to scrutiny to horror to deliberate defiance. He did not shout. He made small moves meant to survive the eyes of men who enforced cruelty. At dawn, the chronicler returned to the yard where the tether post still bore a scattering of salt and old blood. The warden found him and said, "You cross a line, scribe. Put that ledger away." The chronicler laid his palm on the post and said, "I will file the account." "I will write names and dates," the warden hissed. "Do it your way and you will live to regret it," they argued in 6 quick lines, warden's threats. Chronicler's factual retorts, farmhand's crude suggestions. Each line was short and served to change the power balance by revealing what each man would risk. The chronicler's voice never rose. He used calm, merciless grammar to make plain observations that had consequences. He completed the ledger entry at a table beneath a single dying candle. He wrote in careful strokes, victim description, wounds, treatment, names on orders, signatures. Then he sealed the folio with wax and wrote a final line he did not read aloud. For the Abbey record and for the Lord's account, he pocketed the page, then confronted the warden with the salt-stained scrap. "Warden Rise, these names implicate Lord Mayor," he said. "Rise, ist your work, you will leave this alone," Rise replied. The chronicler looked at the warden. His eyes showed the faintest tremor, a physical cue of the story's emotional weight. He would not say what he planned. He left the ledger in the slot for petitions. Someone in the Abbey would find it and the chain might break, or it might not. Outside, prisoners shifted in their stalls and animals licked at warm patches of rope. The chronicler watched a gaunt silhouette across the yard, a man who had once been a tenant and now worked as a farmhand. The chronicler had known the farmhand's family register. He had recorded births and feasts, and the line where taxes stripped a farmer socks. That farmhand, seeing the chronicler, swallowed and stepped away from the post. The chronicler had recorded the farmhand's name elsewhere and placed a marginal note. Handler knew of orders, left ledger gap. That note would later become a key piece in the case he intended to assemble. A twist had occurred. A careless signature and a dropped scrap now made the Lord's involvement visible in a way the fortress could not plausibly deny. He left the fortress with the ledger, or rather, he left a copy where the Abbey clerk would find it, and walked toward the scriptorium. He did not hurry. He kept to familiar streets, and counted 3 stones by the tavern where a woman sold bread. He tucked the remaining original ledger under his robe, close to his chest like a tool. He did not celebrate. He had not saved the prisoner. He had, however, changed the distribution of danger by placing evidence where multiple hands might touch it. That act was his final, deliberate choice in this chapter, a small, visible revolt recorded in ink. At dawn he paused at the tether post and scattered a handful of coarse salt from a cracked clay bowl over the post, the gesture as much symbolic as practical. He left the post soaked in salt, then carried the ledger to the scriptorium. He slipped the ledger into the chest, drew a breath, and closed the lid. When he walked away, someone knocked at the scriptorium door. He stopped, reached for the latch, and felt his fingers tighten around the wood. He looked back once at the scarred post where the animals had licked raw skin, then turned the latch with deliberate speed. The knock came again, harder. He opened the door. A voice outside said, "Scribe." "A messenger from the Abbey asks for a word." The chronicler's hand tightened on the ledger strap. He set the ledger on the table and answered, "Bring him in." He had placed the evidence where it could be read. That was the last concrete beat of this chapter. The ledger visible on the table, a knock at the door, and the potential reader crossing the threshold. Barn animals licked a salt crust at the back of a man's thigh while the bound body convulsed against the tether. The detached chronicler stood a step back, ledger open on his knee, and the taste in his mouth tightened from the odor of blood and livestock. Revulsion pushed at his steadiness. He folded it into his hands and wrote the wound's dimensions. That revulsion would steer his feet later, when rules and orders tried to slow him. He had not forgotten the last time. In the previous entry he had watched a farmhand press coarse crystals into exposed flesh and push a chin down with the heel of a hand. He had watched a fistful of salt bite and had written while his fingers trembled. That memory sat under his ribs now, a bookmarked line he refused to blur. The ledger in his hands was both instrument and accusation. The dawn courtyard smelled of wet straw and animal breath. The chronicler's spectacles fogged once when he leaned closer. He counted strokes in his head as Thomas poured salt from a cracked clay bowl. Thomas wiped his palms on his breeches and spat. "Look at it. Thomas, let the animals finish what you started." The chronicler's pen did not skip. He noted the bowl's chips, the salt's granules, the man's thrash against the post. The central problem sat plain. A sanctioned experiment continued, and a peasant's identity threatened to expand the damage into a scandal. The chronicler's role had been to record, but the ledger's margins had become a choice that morning. He recorded facts. The facts were beginning to demand acts. He breathed and catalogued the wound. Round abrasions, salt incrustation, signs of infection. He wrote the hour. The bound peasant made a sound between a cry and a cough. "Mateo," he tried to say, clamping lips into wet chords. Thomas laughed. "Say it again, Thomas, say who sent you." The chronicler kept his eyes on the bowl. He watched the way Thomas measured salt by the weight of his wrist, and the way the animals angled their heads at the scent. He watched a single animal push its muzzle into the raw place and pull back with a low grunt. A first emotion shift. Revulsion curdled into suspicion. The chronicler suspected method over mercy. He scanned the courtyard for witnesses. Overseer Marta arrived then, cloak dripping dew, voice sharp before she reached the post. "Thomas, Marta, you add too much at the rim." "The protocol demands a thin hand." Marta's fingers tightened on the mandate roll at her belt. She measured explanations with the same exactness she used to measure salt. "Marta, the man thrashes. We'll lose the observation window. Thomas. We need him to suffer long enough to mark the stages." Thomas's voice had a practical bluntness. He tossed the bowl down and readied another handful. "You are sloppy," Marta snapped. "You spill data and ruin the pattern." She the word pattern and pushed a palm flat against the post to steady herself. Dialogue forced the moment into argument. "Marta," the chronicler, and his voice stayed even, "you meet to note recovery rates. This is altering them." Marta glanced at him and then at the ledger. "The ledger helps structure the demonstration," she said. Brother Reinald signed the mandate. "We follow orders." The chronicler watched the claws in her face that softened nothing. Brother Reinald arrived like a seal of paper and command. He walked with a thin staff and a sealed letter clamped under his arm. He set the letter on a splintered table and unrolled it with careful hands. "By my count, Reinald, this is sanctioned. We proceed. The record will show adherence to the approved protocol." He looked at the bound man and then at the ledger. His voice carried authority that made men step closer. The presence of Brother Reinald turned suspicion into dread. The chronicler paused, thumb on a fresh line. He watched Reinald present the mandate. Reinald read a passage aloud that justified the method as deterrent and observation. "We must be certain, Reinald. We must know the body's final tolerance." His words narrowed the courtyard air. The chronicler's jaw tightened. The social stakes shifted. The bound man's convulsions slowed into a cruel, repetitive sway. Marta conferred with Reinald in low tones while Thomas rubbed salt between his fingers like a tradesman checking grain. The animals nosed the man's legs again. The chronicler's pen moved more rapidly. He recorded the time again. He counted breaths and marked the angles of injury. An external event arrived. The bound peasant, teeth clenched, said a name in a spray of blood and spittle. "Marco," he wheezed. Marta's hand twitched from the mandate. "Marco," she said. The name landed heavy. It linked the man to a local magistrate. For the first time that morning, the shape of the punishment could break from a secret ritual into public consequence. This was the second emotion shift. Suspicion changed to alarm. Alarm moved Marta's posture, moved Thomas' patience into greed, and made Reinald look toward the barn with a tight expression. Marta's mouth opened. "Where did you hear that name?" she demanded. "Who you to come here, Marco?" The bound man could not speak clearly. He coughed once and pointed a trembling finger toward the road. "Thomas, tell me you followed the letter, Marta." Her voice did not rise, but the words carried accusation. "You promised this would be a controlled demonstration. Now a magistrate's name appears and the risk widens." Thomas shrugged. "Marta, we do it right and no one asks. We do it wrong and names scatter." "I did it right." He wiped his hands again and reached for the bowl. The chronicler stepped forward. He had been trained to preserve distance. He had learned to let facts do the talk. That morning the ledger's blank lines felt like a weighing scale. He moved to cover the wound with a strip of linen. "Thomas," he said, and his voice was softer than his hands, "stop. I will note the tissue state. Leave the animals. Leave the bowl." Thomas shoved the linen away. "You are a recorder, not a rescuer. Thomas, mind the ledger." He pushed past and spread more salt. A short argument snapped open. "You say that and yet you watch. Marta, you stepped in earlier. You placed the man yourself on the post." The chronicler's hands tightened on the ledger. He touched the edges where ink had blood in the prior entry. "I recorded what I saw," he said. "I will not allow sloppiness to be called procedure." Marta's eyes narrowed. "You overstep," she said. Reinald cleared his throat. There followed 3 rapid exchanges. "Brother Reinald, the ledger," the chronicler began. "We have a mandate." Reinald interrupted. "The mandate stands." "The mandate authorizes observation, not clumsy starvation." The chronicler shot back. "Brother Reinald, Marta, control yourself. This is not the place for a scribe's temper." Guard footsteps sounded. 2 guards appeared at the barn mouth and took positions. Authority narrowed the space again. Tension spiked. Thomas poured salt with a broader, impatient hand. The animals hesitated, then leaned in. The chronicler lunged. He smashed the clay bowl onto the cobbles. Salt scattered like small pale stones across the packed dirt. The sudden sound made the animals flinch. Thomas swore and lunged for the broken rim. The climax arrived as planned. The chronicler's decisive act, the bowl's crash, the attempt to free the tether. He grabbed the man by 2 cords at the collar and tore at the knots. Marta shouted, "Stop him!" Guards moved in. Thomas shoved the chronicler back with the flat of his hand, and 1 guard struck his shoulder with a baton. The chronicler's spectacles skidded on his nose and a smear of ink spread over the ledger where it fell. Amid, chapter mini, cliffhanger. A guard's blade hovered over the chronicler's wrist as he tried to slip a knife to the man's cord. The blade reflected a strip of pale dawn. For 2 heartbeats the courtyard held that single threat. Then a hand grabbed the chronicler's wrist and twisted. "Hold him," a guard barked. The chronicler's fingers clenched around the knife's handle and then let it go. After the uproar, authority enforced order with routine cruelty. Guards seized the chronicler and wrestled the ledger free. Marta took the torn clay and set it aside with a practiced eye. Reinald read the ledger's title aloud and then asked the chronicler coldly, "Why did you intervene?" The chronicler nothing for a moment. His breath came in even pulls. He had broken the rule of detachment by touch. In detention, the chronicler felt the ledger's absence like a missing limb. Guards led him past the tether, and the bound man who was being dragged back deeper into the barn. Thomas' face had a mixture of anger and satisfaction. "He'll teach them a lesson." Thomas Marta as they moved. Marta's face showed a flicker of doubt, but she reasserted composure. "We preserve the method," she said. Locked in a damp cell, the chronicler found a thin strip of light and a floor cold enough to soak through his robe. He sat across from a bench and smoothed his hands over his wet ledger edge. He had expected confiscation. He had not expected the ledger to be taken so thoroughly, inked pages peeled and stacked like evidence. He pressed his palm to the seam of his robe and felt the outline of a single page folded small and damp. The chronicler did not speak of feelings. He catalogued responses. He folded his hands, steepled his fingers, and counted the hours since dawn. He tasted metal and salt when he breathed. He forced himself to slow the pace of thinking. He imagined the ledger's stolen spine as a problem that could be solved by method, not by rhetoric. He would ensure the method and the names survived. He pried at a seam in his robe and slid the folded page into it. Within the cell his resolve hardened into another emotional shift, from alarm to hardened resolve. He set pen to a scrap and copied the vital lines he could still remember. He wrote the man's name, the time, Thomas S. sloppiness at the rim, Martus correction, Reinald's mandate phrase. He wrote the bowl's cracked chip and the way salt scattered on the cobbles when he smashed it. Each line was a small act of rebellion. Outside, the courtyard continued its work. A distant shout rose and then was put down. The bound man did not come to the cell. The chronicler listened to the muffled sound of boots and the closer, softer scrape of animal hooves on planks. He pressed the folded page deeper and felt its dampness warm from his body. The chapter contained at least two surprising reveals. First, the peasant's name linked him to a magistrate, turning a private cruelty into a political hazard. Second, the chronicler's own intervention proved to be less a moment of mercy and more a catalyst that forced the institution to expose its procedures. Martus's small hesitation at the mention of the magistrate revealed that she feared scandal more than suffering. Reinald's calm pronouncements revealed that the mandate had been sought precisely to shield method from accountability. Conversations further grounded motives. Marta, why did you sign the document? The chronicler later, once the guards had left him an hour. Marta did not answer at first. We need the data, she said finally. We need to know where thresholds break. Orders arrive and we fulfill them. You use names when you must dodge blame. The chronicler, you use mandates when you must hide violence. Marta's jaw tightened. You think yourself the keeper of truth. She said, the ledger is a tool. The tool must not become a judge. The exchange left both questions and accusations in the air. Confrontation shaped choices. The chronicler's act had forced others to state priorities. Thomas needed practice to keep his wage. Marta needed order to keep her station. Reinald needed sanction to extend control. Each character's choice pushed the plot. Guards seized him. Marta reasserted method. Thomas deepened injuries. A magistrate's name turned cruelty into a potential scandal. The story moved because characters acted out of clear motives. The chronicler kept making discreet moves. He memorized the sequence of events and hummed them like a list. Bowl, salt, animals, mandate, name. He reproduced the details in the small script he could hide. He did not dramatize. He wrote line by line the way a surgeon maps an incision. Several external events followed every few paragraphs. A guard's return, a shouted command, a distant hoof. Each occurrence forced the chronicler to react physically. Tuck, press, listen. He adjusted the hidden page's position when a boot passed close to his door. When a guard's key turned, he swallowed and kept his face still. Dialogue remained the chapter's engine. In every group the words revealed hierarchy and fear. Brother Reinald, Thomas once, we needed to know where resistance ends, and you found it here, Reinald without emotion. We must educate the magistrate if this spreads, Marta muttered, or bury it and keep the pattern. The choice is control. The chronicler recorded each inflection in the ledger of memory. A late twist changed how earlier events were read. Thomas had not been sloppy by habit. He had been impatient because orders from the magistrate's rival had demanded speed. That meant the magistrate's name on the bound man's lips could represent a deeper political game. The chronicler realized that the experiment did not sit in isolation. It was a tool in networked local power. The revelation hardened his determination to get facts out. The final paragraphs let tension fall but left unease. The chronicler had lost the ledger but not the record. He had intervened and been punished. He had exposed that the sanctioned method served not only observation but intimidation. He could not stop the immediate repetition of cruelty inside the barn, but he could preserve the names, the timings, the broken bowl, the salt spread across cobbles. He wrote the vital points on a folded strip and slid it into his robe's seam. A sound came from the corridor. A guard's footsteps receding, a low murmur of voices. The chronicler steepled his ink, stained fingers and rested them on his knees. He closed his eyes for 3 measured breaths. Then he pushed the folded page further into the seam and tightened the cord at his waist. Outside, a shout rose again, then was swallowed by the barn doors. He waited, ledgerless but not defeated. A guard's boot outline darkened the cell threshold as iron turned in the lock, and the chronicler readied his face to answer whatever question came next. A tethered man convulsed as a sow's tongue scraped at the salt crust on the back of his thigh. The chronicler flinched, closed his glove over the ledger for a breath, then set the book back on his knee and watched the animal's work. Complicity sat in him like a stone. The ledger was both instrument and excuse. He had written this method into the record before, and now the same entries repeated in looped handwriting, a neat cruelty spread across pages. The chronicler had stood at the barn's edge when the farmhand first pressed salt into raw flesh. He watched blood bloom around coarse grains and had catalogued temperature, animal response, and the prescribed duration. Now the same farmhand, named Joran, kept a steady hand on the man's shoulder and whispered directions to the animals. The chronicler breathed through his nose, fingers against the leather binding, measuring the space between observation and action. Noise broke the barn's dark. The bound victim's convulsion, the clink of ring harness, a low squeal from a donkey. The chronicler's face did not change, but his jaw tightened. He shifted the ledger slightly so the page's margin caught the candlelight. Within those small shifts the conflict sat. Record the sanctioned atrocity, or intervene and become the next name on a different list. He lifted the bone-handled quill, not to write yet, merely to feel its weight. The overseer entered then, heavy, souled and precise. "Keep them to it," he said without looking at the chronicler, "record times and reaction." His voice carried the barn's authority. The chronicler felt it pin him wider than the tethered man's ankles. The overseer inspected the wounds with gloved fingers and barked a single instruction. He left no room for argument. Joran obeyed. The chronicler's doubt surfaced as a tightening behind his eyes. He had catalogued 14 procedures like this in the ledger already. Each entry bore the same seal. The ledger's repeated mark proved the method was institutional, not rogue cruelty. He flipped pages with a careful thumb and found the hidden mark halfway down one sheet. A tiny cross scratched under dates. It was a code used by the overseer's circle. The chronicler felt the ledger click in his palm as the implication arrived. This was not an isolated night, it was a program. A sound from the tether, a weak reach, changed the scene. The bound victim moved a hand, fingertips dragging across the barn floor toward the chronicler's boot. He was awake briefly, and his eyes found the ledger. "Please," he said, voice torn. Then his mouth drew back in pain. The chronicler saw the desperation in the motion and heard himself swallow. Joran recoiled when the man's fingers scraped the wood. "Keep still," Joran snapped. "It will be done soon." Joran's vocabulary had no room for requests. He glanced at the chronicler as if seeking permission. The chronicler's fingers curled around the quill. A silent exchange, and the farmhand's face loosened into the practiced hardness of obedience. The overseer returned with a lantern and an inspection list. He stepped between tether posts and read aloud from a folded sheet, 2.5 hours at night cycle. Salt quantity confirmed, animal rotation confirmed. Abort only on explicit ledger note. He flicked a glance at the chronicler. "Do your duty, archivist." The chronicler's shoulders tightened. Duty, the word landed like a commandment on his spine. He obeyed with writing. His hand moved, lines forming cold facts. Wound size, salt quantity, animal type, start time. Words formed like stitches. With each recorded number, the chronicler felt himself tie an invisible knot around the throat of the barn's moral center. The bound victim's convulsions continued. Saliva flecked his lips. At a pause in the writing, the chronicler looked up and the man's eyes locked on the ink-smeared finger. The man tried to say something again, but only a moist cough came out. A new tension rose when the chronicler discovered a pattern in margins he had not noticed before. Dates paired with village names that did not match the overseer's usual supply lists. He traced a column and found the same tiny cross beneath several entries, overlapping with names of men who had disappeared weeks prior. The chronicler's breath shortened. He had catalogued method and outcome. He had not connected the ledger as stamps to vanishing people. The ledger had been a ledger of approval and disappearance. He stood when the bound victim's hand reached again, louder this time. The man pushed his fingers toward the ledger until his fingertips brushed the chronicler's boot. Name it, he rasped. Write what they do. The chronicler felt his throat knit, fingers frozen over the page. He heard the overseer behind him, armor whispering leather, and he heard Joran breathe shallow. The chronicler's first emotion was rooted in complicity. The second was a crack of doubt that widened with each page he read. Name what? The chronicler, keeping his voice even. He stayed in third-person observation, eyes narrowed, counting breaths like measures. The bound victim tried to speak again, salt the salt. They keep records, they make them die with names taken. He coughed and went still. The chronicler's pen hovered. He could write the blunt truth and ignite the overseer's wrath, or he could veil the entry and carry the burden later. The overseer tapped the ledger with a brass-knuckled finger and said, "Precise language, archivist." No embellishment, he put emphasis on the word precise, as if language could sanitize. The chronicler heard the tone as a challenge and, in response, looked for a way to embed truth inside official wording. He sensed then the shift from doubt to a cold calculation. Encode witness without immediate alarm. He made a choice small and deliberate. Where other entries read standard animal cleanings, he wrote instead salt protocol completed. Acute tissue granulation observed. Later confirmation required. Each word was exact, clinical. He did not name the overseer's mark. He did, however, scratch a faint symbol in the margin that only he would recall. A double slash beneath the date. The chronicler's hand trembled when he carved that tiny secret. It was enough to mark the ledger as testimony to someone who knew how to read beneath official terms. Joran watched the chronicler's hand as if it were a metronome. Write the duration. Joran barked, say 3 hours. The chronicler nodded and wrote it down. His admission had 2 layers now. The formal line the overseer demanded, and the quiet mark of accusation he had hidden. His palms left a faint smear of ink on the ledger's corner. The bound victim's fingers went limp. His eyes rolled back. The animal slowed for a breath and then resumed, tongue scraping at salted skin. A sudden event broke through the barn's rehearsed rhythm. A young herd dog nosed into a scattered bowl and overturned it, sending coarse salt grains spinning across the floor toward the chronicler. Salt flakes struck the ledger's edge. The bound victim seized the moment, convulsed, and brought a hand up with a useless swing that knocked the ledger askew. For 2 seconds the ledger toppled, and the man's hand groped for it before the farmhand's knee slammed into his side. The chronicler lunged forward reflexively and slammed the ledger closed. The sound of the cover meeting binding was louder than any voice. "Stop," he said, though he had not meant to raise his voice. The barn went still. The animals stilled mid-lick and the farmhand's knee paused. The overseer took 2 quick steps forward, lantern light cutting across the chronicler's face. His expression hardened into a practiced knife. "What is this?" The overseer demanded. "Archivist, do you interrupt a sanctioned method?" His hand went to the sword at his hip, not fully drawn but clear in the threat. The chronicler felt his pulse under his collar. He kept his face impassive, but every tendon in his neck stood out. He felt the second emotional shift. From calculation to decisive action, end it now, the chronicler, voice steady. He did not say please. He put his palm on the ledger and pushed it across the bench toward Joran. End the animals. Now, his instruction landed like a thing taken from him and given back. Joran hesitated, eyes flicking to the overseer. An argument erupted with quick, sharp lines. You cannot. The overseer began, this is my record. The chronicler cut in, this is my page. End it, Joran, he the names in short syllables, each one measured to pin the moment. The confrontation grew. Words grazed flesh. A rapid exchange followed. 3 heavy, angry lines between overseer and chronicler, then 3 curt lines from Joran as he fought to obey an order that would get him killed if he disobeyed the overseer. The bound victim made a small, ragged sound. It sharpened the argument into decision. Joran's hand shook when he stepped close and snatched at the animal's harness. The chronicler did not move to physically bar him. His action was the ledger's closure and the command. The overseer moved to stop him. They clashed in the barn's central lane, metal slid, boots scuffed ash, the animals scattered. The bound victim gasped, and a trickle of blood ran down his thigh, where the salt had dug deeper and deeper. The chronicler had anticipated resistance. He had not expected the overseer to reach for a torch and fling its light like accusation across his face. Archivist, the overseer hissed, you write to order, not to meddle. You know the penalty, the threat was explicit. To expose what the ledger recorded would destroy the chronicler's position and likely send him to the same fate as those whose names had disappeared from the margins. The chronicler's hand went back to the ledger and he tore 1 page from the book, not to destroy it, but to fold it tight and place it under the victim's chin where blood mixed with salt. He set the torn page there as if it were a breath. Then he pulled the bowl of coarse salt from beside the ledger and tipped it so a ribbon of salt spilled across the floor, leading away from the tether. Joran, shaken, followed the command. He pushed at the animals. Collars, go! He said to the sow. The animals retreated with whines and flaring ears. The bound victim sagged in his bonds. His chest made a shallow, trembling arc. The overseer barked names and threats. He reached for the chronicler's wrist, but no blow landed. Instead, he struck the ledger's spine with his palm, and then kicked it open to the torn page. The barn's climax happened in quick physical beats. The animals withdrew, the bound victim's convulsions stilled to shallow breaths, and the overseer drew a small dagger and slashed the ledger's margin where the chronicler's secret double slash had been carved. He called out, you think you hide marks. His voice did not rise, it cut. The chronicler felt the world narrow to the shard of ink under the overseer's thumb. The overseer yanked the torn page from under the bound victim and held it up by its corner. He scanned the scroll and frowned where a phrase had been altered into clinical bluntness. You spin terms, he said. You make the method clean on paper. He looked at the chronicler and the barn held its breath. The chronicler's chest tightened. He had chosen a risk intentionally. Joran stepped between them and said, Overseer, he stopped them. His voice was small but audible. They are done. The overseer's eyes snapped to Joran. You did this. The overseer demanded. Joran did not answer with words, only a tightened jaw and a shake of his head toward the bound man. The overseer lashed out and struck Joran across the face. Joran stumbled back, hand bleeding, and spat out a curse. There was a scramble. The overseer drew the chronicler toward the tether posts and shoved him. The chronicler's head hit a beam. Light bloomed white at the edge of vision. He tasted metal on his tongue. He remembered the ledger in his lap, open like evidence. For a moment, physical pain replaced the ledger's moral knot with a single immediate ache. He caught his breath and made one more choice. He sealed evidence in a way that would survive his possible removal. When the barn finally emptied into noisy argument, and the overseer called for men to carry the bound man away, the chronicler sat and composed a final entry. His hands had small cuts and the ink smudged, but his letters were steady. He wrote the facts required. times, method, animal type. He then appended a line that read, without flourish, method catalogued across multiple sites. See marginal double, slash, he punctuated it with the same double slash and sealed the ledger with wax he kept in his pouch. The overseer ordered the body to be taken to the courtyard for disposal. Joran slumped against a post and wiped his hand across his cheek. The chronicler closed the ledger and for the first time in many nights reached into his robe and took out a small sealed envelope. He slid it under the ledger and left it visible only to those who knew to look. A notch in its seal matched an old archive key. Then he stepped back and let the men haul the limp body toward the door. At the gate, the chronicler paused. The prey, dawn grey, cut the sky into thin lines. He walked to the outer yard, set the ledger on the ground beside a cracked clay bowl, and poured the remaining coarse salt into it. He did not speak. He sealed the ledger with wax and pressed the bowl beside it as a silent physical witness. It would sit there like a small accusation, crude and undeniable. Before he left, he wrote a final short notation inside the ledger's inner cover. A list of names in careful script, names that matched the vanishing column he had found earlier. He numbered them and punched a tiny hole through the top of the page. It was a slow administrative revenge, not a shout, but a record that could be found later by someone who cared to read between precise lines. He walked out of the compound with the ledger tucked under one arm, the wax seal warm against his palm. He left the bowl of salt where guards would see it on their route. When a sentry glanced at the bowl, and then at the sealed ledger, the chronicler kept his face blank. He did not speak to the guard. He kept to the measured walk of a man who had moved through a night of choices and come out with a ledger that would, in time, be its own witness. At pre-dawn he reached the road and turned his collar up against cold wind. His mind catalogued events with the same mechanical clarity he used in the ledger. Overseer present, Joran injured, bound victim deceased on removal, marginal code located, bowl of salt placed as evidence, sealed ledger removed. He felt the last emotional shift settle, not triumph, not relief, but a precise, sober resolve to let record and small acts stand where immediate justice could not. He did not tell anyone what he had done. He did not announce a reveal or cry out for vengeance. He wrote instead a promise in a notation only he could decode. He knew records traveled differently than words. An entry might spur an inquiry years later, or be hidden in an archive chest, then pulled from dust and read by a hand that understood delicate marks. That delayed possibility was the chronicler's compromise between action and survival. He reached the stable where he stabled his mule, slipped the ledger into a false compartment he had used for decades, and locked it with a key he kept on his cord. He placed the empty wax seal packet back in his pouch. When he closed the stable door, he felt bone, weary and hollowed, but not empty. His ledger bore the scars of the night and the secret mark that would tie names to method when the right hands opened it. Later that day he sat alone at a narrow table, hands washed, fingers stained with black ink. He unrolled a small scrap of paper and copied the double/pattern 6 times. He pushed the scrap into a sealed envelope and handed it to a woman he had known for years at the town's apothecary, a woman named Marta. "Marta," he said. "Deliver when safe." She nodded, looked at him directly, and for a beat he saw that she understood the ledger's weight. She folded the envelope and put it in her apron. The chronicle of this night closed not with a proclamation, but with a practical catalogue. The bowl remained where the gate guards would find it. The ledger had been removed but not destroyed. The names were written and the marginal code copied to a trusted contact. He had acted not with the fire of rescue, but with the slow precision of a man who measured risk and encoded truth into plain things. At dusk, word reached the chronicler that the overseer had questioned Joran and struck him twice before summoning a patrol. Joran had not spoken much. He had bled and kept silent. The overseer had demanded to see the ledger again and been told it was being transferred to the archives for review. The chronicler did not correct the lie. He had planned for such questions. He had also planned for the ledger to resurface, if not by his hand then, by someone who understood the double slash. When the chronicler laid the ledger in its false compartment, he left a single notation on the outside binding. For those who count scars, it was not a rhetorical flourish, but a literal instruction. He had chosen to keep the mechanism of exposure bureaucratic, ink, page, seal, because systems could outlive men. He left the bowl of salt like a small, visible accusation, an object that could not be erased by polite language or official euphemism. At night he dreamed briefly of faces. Not abstract shadows, but names learned from the margins, farmers who vanished, a mason who never came home, a young mother whose bed remained empty. He woke with a small, physical reaction. His fingers curled and then unclenched, as if testing for the ledger's weight. He dressed, took the ledger key from his cord, and walked the archive's aisle as he had for years. Methodical, quiet, carrying a book that would one day be read differently because of a double slash. The chapter ends in action rather than speech. Before dawn, the chronicler sealed the ledger once more, pushed the bowl of coarse salt under the gate's threshold, and walked away with a notation folded inside his coat for Marta. He did not stay to watch the outcome. He left a concrete remnant at the scene. Wax, ledger, bowl, and an envelope entrusted to a woman who would not flinch at the sight of raw salt. The final beat was a small, precise act that transformed his earlier complicity into a paper trail and a public object that could not be sanitized by official language. The barn remained full of smell and muscle. The ledger would bear witness long after the day's buckets were emptied.